Right, good evening everybody and welcome to the second event of the 2021 PRCA's LGBTQ plus group. Thank you so much for joining us to discuss the topic, Beyond June, the importance of brands supporting LGBTQ plus causes and conversations outside of Pride Month. Firstly, I would like to tell you some news since our last event in January. You may be aware that I, at the time, put out a call for one or more, as it turned out, members of the LGBTQ plus community to join me as chairs of this group. And I am lucky enough that both Emma Wright and Traxton have taken on that mantle, and I believe the group is much better for it. Putting our heads together as an ally of the LGBTQ plus community and two members of it who also absolutely want to make sure that there is greater inclusivity in the workplace and in work for this community, I think we can do great things, and the more support we get from you, the better. This evening, I'm lucky enough to be joined by four incredible panelists with experience and insights, both in the PR and communications industry, as well as having roles as advocates and campaigners for the LGBTQ plus community. This group, as you may know, campaigns for teams, work, and an industry that are inclusive, embracing our duty to represent everyone as equal as we promote excellence, progress, and open communication in PR. Before I hand over to the panelists to introduce themselves, I'd also like to remind you that since the last webinar, we have launched a new series called Role Models, which celebrates members of the LGBTQ plus community and their achievements who work in communications. If you'd like to find out more about that, please do go to @PRCA_UK on Twitter or follow us on LinkedIn. At the end of this webinar, we encourage you all to get in touch with ideas of what the PRCA can do to improve LGBTQ plus inclusivity in PR and communications workplaces. We will drop a contact email address for all thoughts, ideas, or concerns. That's also valid, into the comments box. Please talk to us. We want to hear what you have to say. You can also find me or any of the panelists on LinkedIn or Twitter. We would be very glad to hear your input. The makeup of this panel this evening is not intended to be representative of all parts of the LGBTQ plus community. They are passionate, engaged, and inspiring individuals open to sharing their personal experiences and views, and who have a particular interest and important viewpoint on the topic of today's webinar. We want the conversation to be as informal as possible, so please do share your questions and thoughts in the Q&A box. Your input made our last webinar so much better. Thank you. We love the dialogue. We love the fact you were jumping in. We want to have these conversations. I'll do my best to keep up as we go, but for now, without further ado, I will leave the panel to introduce themselves in order, starting with Rich, CEO of Diversity Standards Council, Matt, Corporate Fundraising Manager at Mermaids, TT Carby, Social Mission Manager for Brands on a Mission, and Liam Earle, Internal Communications Consultant, H&K WPP Unite member. I hesitated because I suddenly realized I switched from first names to full names. It's fine. Over to you, Rich.
Hi, everyone. My name's Rich. My pronouns are he, him. I am a white gay man. I live in London. I was a former creative director, which is a bit unusual for going into a D&I role. Usually you find people in kind of marketing and consultancy roles, but I started off as a creative and realized very soon that there was nothing to help any brand that I was working with, any agency I was working with, to help connect them to diverse communities, to help them produce better and more authentic content throughout that production process. So I set up the Diversity Standards Collective a year ago. And what we do is we help companies connect with the whole LGBT community and many other communities to make sure that they can gain insight, guidance, and validation from those very people. I also am part of advertising, which some of you may have heard of. It was, I think, the first advertising and marketing industry LGBT lobbying group, and they really push for better inclusivity in companies and in the comms that come out of it. And then lastly, I created an app called the Right pronoun, which if you have App Store, or I think it's Google Play. You can go and download, and what it does is it allows you to input any form of content that features binary pronouns like he and her, and you can select the pronoun you want to change it to, and it will find all of those binary pronouns and change them to the non-binary pronouns that you need, just to help. It's more of a learning process, but it helps you if you're sending an email or sending out a contract document that may feature those things, to make sure you're inclusive to all the people that you are speaking to. And that is me.
Very good. Over to Matt.
Hi everyone, Matt, he, him, corporate fundraising manager for Mermaids. If you don't know who Mermaids are, we are a UK-based charity supporting transgender, non-binary and gender diverse young people, their families, caregivers and professionals who support them. I lead all external partnerships for Mermaids, including what you may have seen last year's campaign with Starbucks, which was a huge moment for the charity. Before Mermaids, I was at Stonewall for 3 years. I spent 2 years advising the retail sector and travel and consumer goods sectors on LGBT inclusion practices, which involved some partnership work, including Primark. And then I moved into the partnerships team, where I managed half of the Rainbow Laces sponsors, Aviva and Absolute Vodka. So yeah, great to be here and excited to be a panelist. Thank you.
We're very excited to have you. Titi?
Thanks, Katie. Hi, everyone. My name is Titi. I am based in South Africa. I am a Black queer woman. I use she, her pronouns. I'm currently working at Brands on a Mission as the social mission manager, basically very much in the marketing space and using brands as a force for good, particularly focusing on their health and well-being space. My professional career mostly has been in the fast-moving consumer goods industry, focusing a lot on the African continent, as well as I do have international experience working at Ben & Jerry's in the US, where I was leading and working on the brand advocacy and digital campaigns, and basically bringing the social mission to life in the digital space and focusing on social justice. In my personal capacity, I run a page called The Queer's Quest, and basically what the platform is really about is about, like educating on LGBTQ plus matters and really just bringing a positive light to the community. And yeah, very passionate about the LGBTQ plus community and really looking at it from a very inclusive, diverse lens and looking at it from an intersectional perspective. So really excited to be here, and yeah, looking forward to the conversation.
Me too. And last but absolutely not least, Liam?
Well, thanks, Katie. So my name is Liam Earle. So I'm an internal comms consultant at Hill & Knowlton Strategies, so part of the WPP group. And part of my role here is employee engagement and culture change. And a lot of the work we do is grounded in behavioral science. So looking at the natural human behavior and trying to kind of mitigate that with our kind of strategies and our plans. Unsurprisingly, we've had an increase in DE&I related projects with our clients. So hopefully I can share some of that experience and some of that knowledge on the call today. As part of my kind of advocacy and kind of being a champion of the LGBTQ plus community, I'm part of WPP Unite, which is a WPP-wide initiative that promotes LGBTQ plus kind of activities within the group. And at a local level, I'm also working to promote the same thing for H&K, so Hill & Knowlton Strategies, at the London office. So yeah, super excited to be here today, and hopefully I can make Emma proud. I know she can't make the call today, so.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and Emma has put a huge amount of work into preparing this, so I'm going to do my best to do that justice. Anybody who's tuned in to a PRCA LGBTQ plus event in the last year or so will recognize me. My name is Katie Traxton, pronouns she, her. By day, I am the Chief Communications Officer at Formulary. I'm also an ally of the community and have done various things that I'm happy to talk about endlessly for over 10 years, campaigning for equality, diversity and inclusivity. But rather than go into that detail, let's get stuck into the questions. So the first one, and I'm going to go back to Rich, is what does authentic support for the LGBTQ plus community by brands look like in 2021 and beyond?
It's a big question, actually, because I think it can show itself in lots of different ways. And I think that if we start with the problem and then go into the solution, the problem a lot of the time with producing authentic communications is that people try and solve a problem for a community without them. And I think that's really when we see stuff not come across authentically, because, you know, if you're not a person with a certain lived experience, the stuff that you know about that community is fed through actually advertising, media, and other things. And most of that is lies or misrepresentations or other things. So, you know, everything that we know about people outside of our own lived experience, we really need to, you know, go in and get that knowledge for us. So I think the first step for brands to create authentic content is to, one, have a spark to want to do it, and then two, reach out to the community and start asking questions, start finding out how your brand resonates or works with that community. If it's LGBT, and depending on what brand it can be, there's different experience. You know, LGBTQIA is a very wide spectrum, and actually I'm kind of the belief, as BAME was a term that was coined a few years ago and now is quite rightly not used because it homogenizes, is that the right word? Everybody into one lived experience. And actually LGBTQI, they're very different experiences. Yes, we have, you know, some core similarities, but the experience of a bisexual person to a transgender person to a white gay man like myself are actually quite different. Probably the only thing that unifies us is we have to tell people that we are. You know, that's the coming out experience may be something that does it. But again, the repercussions of coming out are very different when you're in different parts of it. So I think it's going out and finding those authentic insights, making sure that they aren't just a trend, or like you have a spark of saying, it's Pride, let's talk about the gays, but actually you got to think about why. Is this a launch pad of something longer? Because we aren't just something to sell your products, we're actually your consumers. So think about us like your consumers. And I think that if you work with the community, for the community, then you're always going to create something that's authentic.
And it's interesting, isn't it, this point of asking questions, in the sense of, what are the questions you should be asking? Should you be asking the community to educate you and do the work and research that you could do yourself? Or should you be asking them questions so that you do understand the people that you're talking to and representing? And I don't know if any of you have kind of had experience of that nuance when you're working with brands.
Do you want me to go again?
Matt, I was wondering if anybody.
Yeah, I have been in sort of creative brainstorm spaces as the only LGBT person, and it can be incredibly challenging, because some ideas that come from people who do not know the community or aren't very well versed can be so tone deaf and difficult. But that is a terribly awkward experience as well, because it places all the onus on that one person to solve these problems, come up with the new ideas, and yeah, basically be the creative source in the room. So it is a very difficult approach to have. And I think I completely agree with Rich that partnership work is essential in this space. And that's a lot of organizations come to us for those ideas. But I think you should be looking internally as well. Like, do you have committees? Do you have LGBT groups? A lot of organizations still don't, a lot do. But it's a tricky way to approach things, because obviously there's not always going to be XYZ, but external voices and questioning needs to be a part of everything.
And Liam, you work in internal communications. So, you know, what is your advice if you're somebody like me in that room and you want to be a good ally to not just the LGBTQ plus community, but any underrepresented group? There are also some underrepresented groups I'm part of. Like, how do you take that heat out of all the attention being on members of that community and actually make sure that there's a general awareness of promoting and celebrating the achievements of all different communities?
Yeah, I think to kind of start with, I think for me it's about the employee experience and making sure that you know, the conversation and the awareness is part of the LGBTQ plus community, is part of the employee experience. So employees are, you know, whether they identify as LGBTQ or not, are able and are kind of knowledgeable, understand, and can advocate where they can. I think just building on Matt and Rich's point, you know, I think employee resource groups are kind of fundamental in, when working on campaigns and projects. There should be representation in the room to make sure that those voices and those views of a particular minority group are being heard and are represented in that sense. But like I say, I think the employee experience point, it's applicable to internal and external planning, really. I think that if the culture is inclusive and diverse and voices are being heard and views are being listened to and put forward, then I think that's only a positive thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because everything the three of you have said so far seems to be kind of universally true, but I'm interested, Titi, in your experience, being in South Africa, and it's a different market to the UK where all of us are sitting at the moment. Do you have the same experience of what needs to be done right now, or do you feel like you're in a different part of your journey?
I think it's there's some parts of it that are the same, right? So a lot of what everyone is saying, I haven't worked in a business that is global. There are some parts around, getting the voices. And I've also been the only person in a room as, one being a Black person, being a woman, and being a queer person in the room. So it's that thing of like, oh my gosh, am I supposed to be doing all the education? An approach that I have seen in certain spaces is around almost having an advisory board, right? And I'm two minds about having an advisory board when it comes to communication. So it's almost a board that, when speaking about specific, like inclusivity, diversity, and equity inclusions, that this is a group that is a bit more knowledgeable and really dedicated to having inclusive communication in the branding and marketing space. The only thing is, again, when those boards are built, it should just, again, not only be the underrepresented, the people who are, the ones that are marginalized doing the education. Allies really need to step up in those advisory boards and do their homework and educate themselves. So again, from a South African perspective, I think quite similar. The only thing is that obviously a lot of the conversations in these multinationals sometimes do happen to be like quite westernized. So it is also important, again, that in that room you do bring almost like a local focus. And that's the nice thing about being in like a diverse organization where you do have those different ideas and just listening to the local voices. So yeah, that's my experience from South Africa. So quite a few similarities, but slight nuances.
And I'm interested to hear from the audience in terms of what you've seen that you think is best practice in this area from brands, and maybe a little bit put politely of what could be better practice. But while you're kind of posting those thoughts, please do post them so that I'm not left hanging. Rich, I think, a lot of what you do with diversity standards really isn't just about, okay, let's make sure that the LGBTQ plus community is represented in work, but it's about not having last minute briefs, not just having a brief for June and then forgetting about it the rest of the year, not making this a kind of niche activity for one community. What advice do you give to brands in order to really seem like they do care? Let's assume they do care. How can they show in their work that they really care versus what they do potentially coming across as tokenistic?
They can do a lot. I mean, it's obviously been Pride season, so I've had a lot of brands approach me and say, we're doing something, and I haven't heard from them ever before, but now I hear from them because they're doing a Pride thing. And I come at it from a very positive point of view, because that's great. You as a company have decided that you want to speak to my community, and I'm not going to turn anyone down who wants to speak to my community, but I'm going to give you guidance on how. And the big bit of advice is always like long term. Like, I'm gay all year round. I don't have a day off. I don't have 364 days off, and then I'm gay for Pride. And it's really, for years, we've, as queer people or as people of color, anyone from a different community has had to watch content that doesn't reflect them back at them and just place themselves. Imagine if I was that person. So it should be all year round that when we're interacting with brands, we're able to see ourselves with that brand like everybody else does. So, and authenticity comes from communication. Like we were just saying about what is the questions that you should ask. And Titi mentions listening. And I think you don't know what you don't know. So as brands, you shouldn't be thinking about necessarily all of the questions that you should have, because you won't know the questions to ask because you don't know what it's like. But the only question you need to ask is, what is your experience like as a LGBT person? and go from there and see where that feeds, start that conversation, because it's all about listening to, because individuals are all different. So when we've had people coming to us from Pride, I've been like, right, let's look at your audience first. So let's not just pick LGBT people because they're trendy, or, you know, that's something you want to talk about. Like, how much, go back to the start, look at your audience, how many they represent. And then we kind of work from a kind of business case scenario, but then we also look like which part of the community might resonate most with your brand. And then we go out and we, you know, through the Diversity Sounds Collective, we speak to LGBT, all types of people from the community, and get those insights and say, what would you like to talk about? How, and in doing that, you won't just produce something one time, because everybody will say not to, and you're not going to not listen to, you know, 30 to 300 people who are all saying your brand is going to be great if you do that. And people just want that support and that knowledge that they're going to do well. So I think everyone should be excited if they're able to say to their company, we're going to speak to the LGBT community, and the heads of say, yes, that's great. If it's at Pride, use that as a platform for the rest of the year. That's my one bit of advice. Think, right, this is the start point. If this is, it's fine that this ignites us, but what are we going to do in September? What are we going to do in January? What are we going to do in December? That was the wrong way around of months, but you know what I mean.
And Liam, if brands don't do what Rich has just described, if they do switch on for Pride and then switch off, what impact can that have on the employees and the culture, both those employees in the LGBTQ plus community and also the impression of the wider potential allies?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I think for me, it's a little bit dual pronged. So kind of firstly, employees who do identify as LGBTQ plus, you know, we know that for those groups in particular, you know, the feeling of belonging and psychological safety is, you know, crucial to so many things: overall happiness, confidence, productivity at work. And I think kind of blowing hot and cold on something that forms part of people's identity kind of puts all of that in jeopardy. I think for those people. Secondly, you know, for the company's culture itself and the overall experience, the effort to kind of promote and encourage, I think it also jeopardizes the kind of company. Jeopardizes kind of the work that companies are putting in to drive allyship with other employees who don't necessarily identify kind of as LGBTQ plus. So, you know, for example, we know that 46% of people that are looking for new jobs pinpoint bad culture as a reason why they leave. So that's an impetus to kind of make that change and drive that kind of positivity internally, you know, whether you identify as LGBTQ or not.
And I guess the other thing, and I don't know, I'm just randomly picking on people now. So Titi, I wonder if you have a perspective on this. There's also a risk with Pride, right? That people see it as, a moment to celebrate. And actually that's not the inception of Pride. That wasn't kind of the point of Pride in the first place. And so aside from the kind of switching on for a week or a month and then switching off, that there's also the nucleus of how you approach an activation around Pride that can have an impact on whether it's authentic or not and resonates with the community, I think.
And I think, again, over the years, as more and more brands have like stepped up and like, you know, stepped into the Pride space, you know, every June people are changing their logos, you're seeing all rainbows everywhere. Very few brands actually know, like you're saying, the inception of Pride, right? And I think going back to authenticity, and I think Rich, you mentioned it, it needs to be very much like a long-term approach, right? And in those months that, you know, January, July, October, the months that Rich mentioned, you know, like how are the brands communicating as well, right? I think when you are communicating only during Pride Month, or when your brand is just stepping in like these little burst moments, there's almost this, it's very like, you know, you've heard of like rainbow capitalism and like what it's very extractive, right? And it's almost like there's a dehumanization of the LGBTQ plus community. It's just those little thing, we come in, we just put a little bit of rainbows and so forth. But again, we're human beings, right? I want to see an ad of me being flighted in September with my girlfriend walking in the streets, right? Just normal things that normal people do. And so I think beyond long-term communication that these brands do, it needs to just stop being love is love and, you know, around DE&I topics. It really needs to stop being more authentic and just humanizing LGBTQ plus people. And I think it's really just really rooted in the fact that where we are right now specifically is, heteronormativity is like what we always gravitate to, cisnormativity what we gravitate to. So when you are in a room being like, hey, let's have a gay couple. A lot of the brand people sometimes are like, oh, I'm not sure, this is not an LGBTQ plus campaign, but you're like, no, it doesn't have to be. It's just, let's just show a gay couple in our ad. And, it will take away from the brand messaging. So I think it's important that, yes, we do have that long-term communication, but what is that long-term communication also really, really matters. It needs to go beyond that love is love, just show us in normal settings and so forth. So, yeah.
Yeah, we're actually really boring, aren't we? Sorry, I was going to say, like we said this.
I know, right?
I actually just on a Saturday go out and buy dog food and then come in and watch Netflix. But I'm never showed in an ad doing what I actually do. I'm apparently a drag queen in every ad for every company.
You're holding rainbows wherever you're going.
Going around, and actually, I'm sat in my boxers. Like I've literally just escaped for half an hour to the corner shop, and that's about it. And I think you've hit the nail on the head, Steve, because if you're white, straight, able-bodied, you are showed in every facet of your life, right? You go and buy an ice cream, you go buy dog food, do these things. But as gay people, we are celebrated, which is fantastic. But actually, it's not normalizing our communities. It's like if you've got a range, it normalizes it. But when you have one point of view, actually, that becomes a dominant narrative that then others us as the one. My mum's got even asked me if I wear drag because she says so many drag queens that she thinks that that's what gay men do. So she said to me, "Oh, do you dress up in drag?" And I was like, "No." But and I think that's what we have to remember. Like you said, like we're actually just, we're human. So if you put it in a metaphor, like with friends, right? If you see a friend once a year, how close to you are them? Yeah, how close to you are? You know what I mean? If you see a friend, once a month, you become really close to them. And it's brand awareness, isn't it? Like if you see someone quite often and you're having a good communication to a conversation, you're going to remember that brand. You're going to want to shop with that brand. You're going to see that brand next month. If it's once a year, in a month's time, I'll forget about that brand and I'll move on to the ones my friends I'm seeing, every week. I think that's a nice way of looking at it.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I remember working about 3 or 4 years ago now with some GB athletes. And one of the guys came up to me, he's gay, and he said, everybody else was asked to be in this advert as, you're the sprinter and you're the rower and you're this. And they were like, and you're representing the LGBT community. And he went, no, but I'm an athlete too. I have my sport. I also happen to be gay. Why am I representing this community rather than being presented in the same way as everybody else? But it's interesting, this point of normalization. Having said which, one of the reasons originally I was going to be on the panel rather than presenting this is because at Formulary, and obviously motorsport, which I've worked in for most of my career, is one of the most kind of like historically patriarchal industries you can find. We have been doing our best across all areas of our equality, diversity and inclusion to make sure that we're as accessible and welcoming to all groups as we possibly can be, and caused a bit of a stir when we announced our kind of ambassador or influencer tribe earlier in the year. And the headliner was Bimini Bombulash, paired with international motorsport, not what was expected. So there is also a place for drag queens and also a place for normalization, because there's all different people who are much more interesting for their differences than their similarities in all groups. Matt, I'm really interested. I reckon that a lot of people are approaching Mermaids, particularly at this time of year, saying, work with us. But you chose to work with Starbucks. What is it about Starbucks that has the kind of depth and resonance and realness that made you think this is the partner we want to work with?
Yes, my inbox is a bit crazy these 2 weeks before June, as people remember the rainbows are coming. Starbucks was, I think, from what we've just been talking about, a really great example of that normalization and like shining a light on a specific experience that cis hetero people and a lot of cis LGBT people will never experience. But Starbucks approached us actually before their shortlist, well, when they made the shortlist for the Channel 4 award. And we had kind of a brief of what the ad was and the insights it was based on. And based on that and us talking internally, we were like, okay, this sounds like it has legs. It's not window dressing. It's not kind of just splashing rainbows over a Starbucks door. We'll agree in principle that if this is to be successful, we would partner with them. The ad won, so the the gut feeling was right. But I think with Starbucks and for any partnership I would enter into as a charity partner anyway, it was never just going to be the financial side. So they were really receptive and open to a program of work that we did pretty much from the point they won. So we were at every stage of creation. So we reviewed sort of storyboarding. We were there on set on the filming days. We helped with casting. We helped with sort of aftercare of the cast itself. We were point of contact should they need it. And there was an internal piece of work of, I think, 4 sessions across the business, from HR to PR to the leadership team, and kind of seeing the president sort of express how proud he was of the campaign, like, was truly a career highlight. But I think for them and for us, it was just the authentic insight that they found, and they had found YouTubers on YouTube, obviously, talking about their trans experience, of how going into Starbucks is a great way to test your name. And we went to our community at Mermaids and said, has anyone actually done this? And like, we had 10 people go, yeah, I did that as well. So on launch day, we had like press going out with people talking about their experience. It was a 360 approach. It wasn't just, we got this ad, we want to give you some cash to legitimize it, which I think a lot of charity partnerships around Pride can become. It wasn't run through Pride. It launched in February to March. I think that was due to Channel 4's schedule, not because of choice, but that singular experience of trying a new name in Starbucks, it really resonated. And if you've obviously seen the ad. So I think without that, we probably wouldn't have been as bought in, or we wouldn't have gone ahead in the first place. But yeah, it was that depth of approach to us as well that was so important.
And it is interesting because that comes back to the point, doesn't it, about that resonating with everybody's everyday life and what happens. And the interesting thing for me, because I do a lot of work with the European Sponsorship Association, is when you talk about brand partnerships in general, everybody says they have to be authentic, they have to be integrated, they have to bring the two sides to life. So why would it be any different around Pride? Why would people think suddenly they can revert to some kind of badging exercise, albeit that the badge somehow relates to a rainbow, just because suddenly they need to potentially sometimes tick a box at a certain time of the year? And while I've got you, Matt, I'm very interested also, and I think Rich might have something to say on this as well, you may all do, in the kind of dangerous discourse around the trans community. So Rich touched earlier on the fact that we kind of say, oh, LGBTQ plus, LGBTQIA, in various forms, but there is a huge difference still relating to acceptance and inclusivity of different parts of that community. What would your advice be as to how brands can make sure that they're not just kind of going for I don't know what phrase to use, but unfortunately quick win, or like latching onto the easy part, and they're actually tackling the really tough taboo conversations?
I think, as we said at the beginning, engage with the community. I think it was so important for Starbucks, in instance, to have my trans colleagues in the room at every stage. But in tackling those really tricky conversations, you can have such a huge impact, like the stories we heard from young trans kids who are seeing Starbucks stand up for them and what that meant to them, and such a massive brand creating a space for them was, invaluable. And that was like the most important thing to me at the end result. It wasn't the money, it was like the impact that this is having on these kids. But at the same time, it's so important to remain educated and know what on earth is going on. Like the challenges for the trans community at the moment in this country are pretty terrifying. There's legal challenges coming left, right, and centre. There's a high court case that essentially prevented like life-saving treatments for under 16s, which is now in some way, there is a route around that, but only if you have parental consent. So if a trans young person doesn't have parental consent for, say, puberty blockers, then they have no access to them. And then there's legislation and government challenges. And I think if you're not aware of that, then you can be if we approach that conversation, it's not going to come from an authentic place. There's that word again. But I think knowing that the depth of the challenges, like an LG, B, and T are all distinct. So yeah, I don't know if that actually answers your question, but staying abreast of what is actually going on, because yeah, I don't think you should be talking to the trans community in a campaign or as a brand unless you know the actual challenges and can highlight those in a way as well, and the staff behind that knowing those challenges as well.
I think it definitely sheds light. Go on, Rich. I was going to ask you anyway, so carry on.
No, I was just going to say, like, Matt's absolutely right, because you actually you're not going to be speaking to the trans community if you haven't spoken to them first, because a list of things Matt just came up with then are probably a lot of things that, I mean, even I don't know about that's going on with the trans community at the moment. And I think in the roles that we do, we've been trained to get ourselves in the mindset of others. So we think we need to answer questions if they're creative briefs or write stories. And we think our job is to make those stories up or resonate. But actually, what our job is to do is to, before we do anything, is go and speak to those communities, find those interesting stories, and then we nourish and make them flourish. I think that's the best. That rhyme, that really wasn't meant to. But
I thought you prepared it.
That's how I think we tell authentic stories, because a lot of the time with diversity, people come to me at casting stage, and that's when they actually think that that's the best time to approach people, or they've got an idea, they go and cast trans people, then they go to someone like Mermaids or myself and say, this is our story, what do you think? And you're like, well, all I think is it's what you think. You know, a lot of brands now will just speak about the transition when it's to do with trans people, because that's all they know. That's all, you know, a lot of the consultants when we do trans talk will say, brands think that all we do for the 90 years that we're alive is just slowly transition. And that's all that we actually do. And actually, it is a big part of a trans experience, but it's part of a trans experience. Again, 5 years after they transition, they may be buying dog food or going to the shops or drinking a Coca-Cola. And there's so many amazing stories out there that you don't know. And I think if you change your mindset to think, right, the first thing I'm going to do is find these exciting stories rather than try and think up exciting stories, you'll start from an authentic place straight away and then be always creating something that will resonate.
Yeah,
it's so mad, right? Because we're working PR and communications. And in any other instance, when would we ever say, oh, we're either going to invent a story or we're going to come up with a random story and then try and get people to publish it? Like you always start with the insight and the audience. So again, to come back to the point I made about partnerships, why would it be any different here? Titi, I think you wanted to add something, and I'm also interested in exploring a bit more a point you mentioned earlier about intersectionality.
Yeah, cool. Let me just quickly just add on to what Rich was saying right now, and Matt as well. So I think, again, like definitely, you know, engaging with the community again is so important. But I think brands need to engage with the community again, more than just like, oh, we're about to do this piece of creative, let's get a trans community lens in. It also needs to be like, again, brands benefit so much during Pride Month financially from all, you know, selling all this rainbow merch and so forth. So I think giving back to the communities that you're extracting from, right? So sitting with the trans community, whether it's like, you know, trans folks directly or trans nonprofits and trans leaders in this space, and be like, okay, cool. All the issues that Matt mentioned, for example, how I think brands have a role to impact those spaces, right? So it goes beyond engaging with these brands, with the trans community, to be like, oh, how do we depict you in our communication? It is how else can we use our resources, our reach, our, you know, audience, our specific expertise to really drive change that you need. It's more than just seeing myself on TV. That's good. Representation is very important. But, you know, there are also these other issues that I really feel like brands have a role to play in, you know, eliminating these issues, and engagement with, you know, the people on the ground and lived experiences is also very important for brands. Just want to add that.
I mean, absolutely. I think, and tell us about your experience of intersectionality and how that kind of also impacts narratives, because there can be a tendency, right, in terms of diversity and inclusivity, for people to say, oh, okay, this is going to be something about the LGBTQ plus community, this is going to be about women, this is going to be about race. And life is not, you know, on the one hand, life might be quite simple because we're all buying dog food. For me, it would be cat food, to be fair. But on the other side, it's not as simple as us fitting into a neat box of even one underrepresented group.
Yeah, this could be a whole like discussion in itself. So I'll try to keep it short. But I think, again, like, intersectionality is one very important in many spaces, right? So when we have seen some improvement in like LGBTQ plus representation, but we need to be honest, it is very white, it is very cis, it is very able-bodied, it is mostly men, cis men. So it's a thing of when you are bringing through the communication and engagement. So from a communication point of view, when you are showing, queer folk in your communication, what do they look like? Is it really, really diverse? I don't know if you saw recently, it was in the US, Calvin Klein had, I think she's a trans woman model, and, and that was like, people were like, oh my gosh, Calvin Klein did this thing, but it was like a whole thing of like, yes, finally, she was Black, she was dark-skinned, there were so many elements that were not the norm, right? So I think intersectionality is very important, and a lot of brands feel like, once I've just, I've put a gay man, a white gay man, and I've done my part in the LGBTQ plus community and in terms of communication. And then also from the engagement point of view and seeing how you can make a change, it is also about like, when you are engaging with the community or nonprofits and so forth, what do the people in those rooms look like? Is it going to be predominantly white, able-bodied cis folks? And that's where intersectionality really comes through. You need all those different lenses from, women, trans folk, you need Black people in the room, just to give you a different lens. And I don't know why it's still such a difficult conversation to have. Having been a Black person in these rooms, I always feel like I'm the one bringing up Black issues. When I'm sitting in a room of like, a lot of like heterosexual folks, I'm always like, oh my gosh, here I come again with a queer lens, So I think it's still, unfortunately, quite a difficult conversation to have, to bring in all those lenses, because you're always that person that's, oh, there she goes again. But it's very important to bring in that intersectional lens and looking at, the non-conventional view of what we're used to seeing in the media. And yeah.
We've had some audience engagement, so I'm going to flip over to what they're saying. First of all, a bit of insight from Kate Addy. She is from Ready 10, and she said, we did exactly that. So speaking to the communities, as we were saying, who you should engage in order to find out what's actually happening. For a report we did for Total Jobs about issues facing the trans community in the workplace. We consulted with a huge number of people in the trans community to ensure the correct tone was struck. We covered the right issues. The language we used in our survey was right. And every asset we created for the campaign was created by trans people. This report was also a follow-up to the same report done by the brand 5 years ago. So it was an important follow-up, exploring and highlighting real issues. However, the main thing for us was about not creating clickbait headlines, but working with partners to provide advice and guidance, so there was some real tangible action to come out of it. Well, that sounds very good. But we also have a question, which I think is very interesting, because it talks about that point of visible versus invisible diversity. And I've actually been to some really interesting talks where I've heard people speak about, if you're part of an underrepresented group because of the color of your skin or your birth gender, then typically you will engage with that as a part of your daily life at work. There are other areas of diversity, of course, where you actually get the choice about whether you're going to reveal which group you are part of and whether you feel comfortable with that revelation. So the question from John, and I'm going to pick on you, Liam, so listen carefully because you haven't spoken for a while, is, if people are sat at home buying dog food or cat food, how are you expected to demonstrate to a viewing audience that that individual is LGBTQ plus when there isn't, or shouldn't be, visual or audio markers? If it's to become commonplace, shouldn't it also be unobvious and therefore not representing the community? How can we achieve both of these things at once?
So I'm going to come at this from a kind of internal standpoint. I think it kind of carries on from the conversation or the point that TT was making around. I think that everyone was saying is kind of echoing everyone. I think, the awareness and education doesn't need to be just authentic, but it needs to be meaningful. So from an internal standpoint, working with various organizations, I think, telling these stories and breaking with convention and making sure those stories are by people that are, are diverse and that are truly representative of the full spectrum of, whether you're LGBTQ or plus. So yeah, I think only then, and hearing those stories and knowing, and being aware you can't know what you don't know, so I think by hearing those stories and hearing the kind of variances within those stories and from those people, then you can truly build allyship internally. And I think that then kind of drives when you're going into a creative process, for example, that then drives a different conversation in the room.
It's also interesting, right? Because in the same way that, in my experience anyway, the majority of people I work with would not tolerate open discrimination. However, microaggression is something that the majority of people may not even always notice or might turn a blind eye to because it doesn't seem like such a big deal. In the same way, you could have like micro progression, because if you have a piece of communication where it's literally as subtle as somebody referring to their partner by pronouns which show that it's a same-sex partner, that in itself is a normalization. Or you have your dog food commercial, because I feel like Rich is also trying to get himself a commission here.
I need a dog food brand, please.
For any dog food brands out there, you have your dog food commercial and it's actually focused around the point of the product, but then you have a same-sex couple who are buying the product. Is very different to, again, something that can equally be normalized. And I talked about our experience, and we wanted to be quite provocative by working with Bimini, but you can show a drag queen in a campaign with a racing car. You can also show a gay couple or a trans couple or a trans individual at home in the same environment as you could somebody from a heterosexual relationship or the kind of majority community, whatever that is in any given situation. I don't know, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we do training about this all the time, constantly, because brands do ask that question. And I think you can show the LGBT community and other communities in lots of different levels. Yes, you do have to go a step further than maybe how you would represent a white straight person in an ad, just because you want to make sure their representation is shown. For example, your Formula One example, if you were doing an ad, you could have a drag queen in it. You could have somebody, a guy, and perhaps get in his car, and you just see a text with a good luck heart, and that name on the top says Ryan. Do you know what I mean? And it could be as subtle as that. Or we talk about a lot. There's also layers. Like a good example is Shrek, or a Pixar film. Okay, when you watch that with I have a 5-year-old, this is why it's my example. When you watch a Pixar film, my daughter, she's 5, she finds it hilariously funny. There's also another layer on top of that, which is like sexual innuendos and adult jokes, which I get that she doesn't get. Now, we're both leaving that film really enjoying it, but for different reasons. And when we work with brands, we say to them, like, think of your ad as layers. Like, if you want to do it subtly, you don't have to be telling cis white straight people the whole time that this is a transgender person. But in an ad we recently did for a shaving ad, it was an American shaving ad, and they had person shaving, and in one edit you couldn't see their top surgery scars. And they were like, well, how do they know that's a trans person? And by speaking to the trans community in America through us, I'm not sure how many people know, and this is my top level knowledge, is that in the UK we have the NHS, and a lot of trans people go and get their testosterone from the NHS injected, or they use a gel to rub it on their chests. In America, they don't have that set up, so a lot of people are self-injecting during the day, which means that they have a yellow sharps box or a sharps box in their bathrooms in America, and maybe in other countries. So all they did was put a blurred out sharps box in the bathroom next to other stuff. Now, when we then tested that ad, a lot of people who weren't transgender didn't get that nuance, but they saw a man shaving, which they were like, great, this resonates with me. The trans community immediately, because we're hyper aware of our own lived experience, saw that sharps box and thought that person must be trans, because, or maybe they're trans, and it resonated with them as well. So I think there's multiple layers we can look at it. But again, how do we add those cultural nuances is simple. Is we ask those people with that experience, like, what little subtle things do you do during the day that can let your community know we want to speak to them without having to have a drag queen or say love is love and do this big LGBT thing?
That reminded me of that Super Bowl ad for Coke, and they just had a line that said, I put up because I won't remember off the top of my head, there's a Coke for he and she and her and me and them. And just including that and them at the end acknowledges gender non-binary people. I don't think they explicitly were like, here's a trans person on the screen. They just showed lots of different people. It's just that little thing that just shows acknowledgement. If you're not part of the community, or you're not non-binary, or you don't it'll have aware of these things, as with that shaving example. But if you do hear that, you will pick it up. And you're like, oh, I'm part of this, and they recognize me. So yeah, I think I'd love to see ads with groups of people where one person is maybe trans or not trans, or maybe not, like, you know what I mean? Like, it's just part of that group, rather than this is the focus of this ad. It's just embedded. And it's not always, you don't always have to do it for every ad. Maybe dog food doesn't need an LGBT person selling it. Maybe it's not the right time.
And to your point, Matt, about authentic partnerships, you know, to come back to what we were describing, you know, at Formulary, I don't know how much anybody knows about Formulary, but very simply, like, it was founded to counteract climate change by accelerating the adoption of electric vehicles. Now, for us, there's also a huge amount about sustainability that extends beyond environmental sustainability to economic and social sustainability around the world. That means that when we wanted to create an influencer tribe of 50 people, everybody inherently has to believe in that mission. So if you're going to work with a drag queen as your headline artist, then that has to be a drag queen who also is vegan and is also gender non-binary and is also progressive in many, many other ways that are aligned to our mission. There's also 49 other members of that influencer community who, yes, people might not even realize represent other areas of LGBTQ+, also represent different religious, racial backgrounds, have different physical and mental abilities, neurodiversity, etc., and also other things that they campaign for as allies. And for us, it's about the collective and how it comes together and how they work, because it's not, and I say this a lot, it's not about, oh, look, we have a diverse group of people. It's, this is representative of the world. Everybody should see someone who resonates with them, who they can relate to, and who is a role model for them. And that's obviously another reason why we did our role model series that Rich featured in. But I think you had something else you wanted to say, Titi.
I want to ask a question more to Rich. Sorry, I don't know if I should ask a quick question, but it's just around the shaving example you mentioned now, right? So you mentioned that, you know, the video surgery, and I'm thinking out loud here. So what is the role, going back to the whole thing around like normalization, right? Like the trans community, like you're saying, identified with the little yellow box in the corner and was blurred out. Why is it still so subtle, right? Why isn't it like, yeah, someone's got gender affirming surgery, they've got their scars, and that's fine. It's not like this ad is about, you know, the transgender community. It's just like a trans person is shaving and that's what they're doing because they shave. Why does it need to be so subtle, blurred out little box in the background? This is more just a question. I'm trying to figure it out, just, you know, like I'm thinking out loud here in terms of like, then how do we trade that line in these communication spaces where, you know, like, again, let's say someone who's not trans didn't just like, oh, it's just a man shaving and they left there. And again, this just then doesn't bring the LGBTQ plus community to the forefront, and it's like almost like lack of dehumanization. We're other, you know. Yeah, so this is just, yeah.
No, it's a great question. And I think when we try and solve LGBT issues, we want to do everything in one ad, and it just can't be done in every facet. And actually, when I'm talking about that, we were working with the brand, they had a 60, a 30, a 20, and a 10-second cut downs of these ads. And in the 10-second cut down, because of the product placement and everything else, that you couldn't see the top surgery scars, and the background itself was all blurred out as well. So that's why it was blurred out in a non-subtle way. But I suppose that you have, as brands, we have multiple different platforms to talk about multiple different things. And the best thing about these platforms is they're all so different that we can talk about different topics. So if we are on our TV ad doing a big, an ad that features like men or masculine people, we may want to show it for that instance in a subtle way, or we want to show it, you know, there's top surgery scars and there's this, so you see it all. Then on our social media, we might want to tell those stories individually of each different person and go deeper into their lived experience. And then on another platform, we might want to tell. So I think that we have to think about our ads as the 360 campaigns that we put out there anyway, even if it's a PR story about that person and about all the other men in there, like how, you know, the normalization means that we have to find human insights. And why Starbucks, for me, works so well was because the human insight is we all go to Starbucks and get our names on coffee. I make up names when I go to Starbucks to put in there, right? Because we do. But then you see that ad and you're like, wow, like they're not, you know, I make fun of finding out names. This is super important to that person. It's their identity. And you forget when you have your name that is just your name, how important that name and that identity actually is. but it was a human thing. We all go and buy coffee, we all tell our name. And I think if we can find those insights that link us all, so shaving, the trans masculine guy as well as the other guys all shaved, and that was a human insight. And then it's how do we then tell those deeper narratives about how they got there and how different they are, because it is different for, shaving can be different as well for the Black community as it well can be for the transgender community. So I mean there is multiple different types of stories to be told there.
Cool.
Well, I think we're going to have to wrap up because we're 2 minutes to, but if anybody wants to get in touch, please do. You should be able to find you can find the PRCA very easy. Like I said, on Twitter, it's at @PRCA_UK. The panelists, I don't know, can we just do a quick round robin and you can share any social handles or appropriate ways of getting in touch if people want to? On my screen, I've got Liam, Matt, TT, and then Rich.
Do you want me to say them or do you want me to write them in the chat?
Oh, I mean, like, go wild.
Oh, well, I mean, if you want to get in touch with me, I will work at the Diversity Standards Collective. You can email me at rich.miles@thedsc.org.uk, but I'll write it all in here so everyone can have it.
Great.
Same for me too. So my email address is liam.earl@hkstrategies.co.uk, and I'll also put some additional details in the chat as well.
I'm just Matt at mermaidsuk.org.uk. We do have a corporate page on our website if you're interested in getting involved. And if you want to fundraise for us over Pride, we're launching our Pride campaign very soon.
Cool. I'm just DT Gabi. You can find me on LinkedIn and the social platform that I mentioned around LGBTQ plus education on Instagram. I'm about to put in that handle right now. Yeah, that's me.
Great. And I'm Katie Traxton. You can find me, I have a very unusual surname. You can find me easily on LinkedIn. You can find me on Twitter at @KTraxton. And I would like to know, please do get in touch. I would really, really like to know what you liked about this evening's event, what you think could have been better about this evening's event, what else you would like to hear us discussing. Fundamentally, these webinars are to try and have a conversation, learn things. Like, I come off them having learned things every time, and I would like to know what you would all like to know more about. So please do get in touch. We are really open to feedback. The same applies to Emma and Ant, my co-chairs. It will definitely be one of them hosting the next one. You won't have to hear from me again, but I am available and I will be doing things in the background. So keep in touch. Thank you very much to all of the panelists. I think I probably speak on behalf of everybody listening when I say that that was very insightful, and I hope that everybody learned as much as I did.